Well, of course, what the question of what field research is somewhat, it's a somewhat ambiguous issue. That I don't think there is a sharp line between field research and, I suppose, lab research would be the alternative. But basically, I would say that the most important distinguishing characteristic of field research is that you are working in the natural habitat, as it were, of the people whom you are studying, as distinguished from lab research, in which you are essentially bringing people into your own habitat. And I think this is the fundamental difference. So the type of field research that is most clearly can be most clearly defined as field research in terms of its basic characteristics is naturalistic observation. And I would say if one then in a naturalistic situation also interviews people, but talks to them within the natural situation, that would of course also be part of field research. As you move away from that, as for example you move in the direction of opinion polling, survey, traditional survey research, I think that's often also in our field called field research. And I think it is field research, but in a more marginal way. It's field research in the sense that you are coming to people in their homes, let us say, or in their environments, rather than having them come to you in your own environment. So in that sense, it's field research. But on the other hand, you're coming to them with a standard set of questions that you have designed that doesn't grow out of the natural situation. So in that sense, it deviates from what I would regard as the major characteristic of field research. Also, of course, one often manipulates the situation in the field. And now that, I think, does not necessarily reduce. Again, I think it's a deviation from the notion of studying people in their natural habitat. But sometimes these manipulations are just manipulations of the natural habitat. So, for instance, if you have an organizational experiment in which you are which you're interested in comparing different ways of organizing an office, or different climates in a classroom, let us say. Now, these represent manipulations, but they are variants of the natural situation. Usually it is management that decides on how to organize an office, or it's the school administration that decides on what kind of, how to run a classroom. And so if they decide to do it in different ways, even though it's done for experimental purposes, I still would see that as variants of the natural situation. And so I would still see that as field research. Similarly, take the sort of traditional field experiment in social psychology, let's say an experiment in helping behavior. Again, the experimenter manipulates the environment. The experimenter creates an incident, let us say. But to the extent, the experimenter, well, let's say you have an experiment in which people are collecting funds on the street. Well, it's a variation of the kinds of things that people are naturally exposed to in their habitat. And so in that sense, I would say that's still a type of field research. To make the thing more confusing, though, I would say that certain laboratory experiments can also be seen as field research. And my best example here is the Milgram obedience studies, because basically what Milgram was doing was to study laboratory behavior. I mean, the subject matter was essentially how people behave in a scientific laboratory. And so in that sense, the laboratory was the field. So anyway, as I was saying, the line between field research and laboratory research is not necessarily a fine one, but the main characteristic is the extent to which one is trying to capture the natural elements of the situation. And this then also, I think, is a major problem from a methodological point of view. It's a problem of how, in some respects, the laboratory situation makes it easier for the experimenter because the experimenter has a great deal of power in terms of controlling the situation. Not absolute power, obviously, for a variety of reasons, because while there are ethical constraints and there are practical constraints and there are the constraints coming from people's willingness to put up with things. So there are obviously constraints, and there are credibility constraints and all of that. But the constraints in field research, I think, are greater because, in a sense, the experimenter has to adapt himself or herself to the requirements of the natural situation. And that is, there are skills both in trying to capture the critical elements of the situation, to understand what the elements of the situation are. There are interpersonal human relations type skills that are involved in terms of gaining the cooperation of the individuals. There are political issues involved. Usually you're not, or very often you're not dealing with isolated individuals, but you're dealing with individuals who are within some kind of organizational setting or community setting. And you have to be concerned about getting, let us say, approval up the hierarchy, or of avoiding suspicion. Let us say if you're doing a community study or say an ethnographic study, you have to attend to the fact that people are often suspicious of outsiders coming in to do research. So you have all of these kinds of human relations problems that you have to deal with. Now, from an ethical point of view, I think the major problems in field research stem from the fact that you are very often operating in a real-life situation, and therefore what happens in that situation is more likely to have real-life consequences for the people. In that sense, laboratory research often is less, is less risky, because it is an isolated situation, whereas in many kinds of field research, you're dealing in the real-life situation. And some of these problems maybe we'll come to when I talk more specifically about the kinds of things that I'm doing.
You talk basically about interpersonal skills, political skills, and ethical. I want to push you a little further on the ethical, unless you feel you'll talk about them in relation to your own study. There's a school over at the business school. Some of them would say, don't tell anybody what you're doing. When you go in, just tell them after. And you're obviously going in good faith, and you're a responsible researcher. And then there's another school that says you have to inform people before you go in. How do you feel on that issue?
Well, on the whole, I would come out very strongly on the second side. In other words, to me, a fundamental principle, ethical principle in the conduct of research is the principle of informed consent. Now, I am somewhat flexible on this. I don't think that one can make absolute statements, and there are certain kinds of exceptions that I would recognize. For instance, to take an extreme case, if you're doing naturalistic observations, let us say you're at a football game, and you are interested in observing the reactions of the audience to what is happening. And so you're sitting and you're watching people and you're taking notes on who is jumping up and who is cheering and so on and so forth. Well, now, my feeling is that in that kind of situation, it is not necessary to obtain the consent of the people whom you are observing, because of the fact that you're operating in a situation that is totally public. You are not identifying the people. You don't know who the individuals are. There's no danger that that any particular individual will be embarrassed by what you publish. Or that information about any particular known identified individual will come out. They are in a situation in which they have to assume that their behavior is observable. I mean, they're in a public situation. Now, they don't usually assume that it's going to be observed by a social scientist who is, noting down the frequency of their responses and all of that. And so technically, one could say that even here, informed consent would be desirable, because you are, because in a sense, you're doing something that is somewhat out of the ordinary. Nevertheless, I'm sufficiently flexible here to say that in this situation that is as public as this situation, and in which the individual is not identified, and with all of these special characteristics, and in which gaining informed consent would in effect make the study impossible, because what you're trying to do is to observe the ongoing behavior in the situation. Now, now let me just add that I would feel differently if you were using certain equipment. Let us say if you were recording, if you were using secret hidden microphones or anything of that sort. That's a different situation. People have a right to expect that they're not going to be, even in a public situation, they have a right to expect that they're not going to be secretly recorded. But they do not have a right to expect that their behavior won't be watched when they're in a public situation. And so I would say the social scientist is in the same position as a journalist or a writer or anybody else who's standing there and observing. So I'm giving this as an example to say that my position on informed consent is not absolute. But basically, I feel that people, if something is done to people that has potential consequences for them, they should be given the opportunity to decide whether or not they want to take the chances that that this entails. And I can't see any other way of doing that than by giving them the opportunity to giving them enough of a basis for knowing what is, first of all, that something is being done to them, and what it is, and what the possible consequences are, so that they can make an informed judgment about their own interests.
Now, how do you differentiate between individual informed consent and group informed consent? For instance, you do a survey, and you don't identify individuals, but you identify groups. Blacks in the South are doing something. Isn't that sort of an invasion? I realize that it's a much grosser level, but
yeah,
it's the same logic.
Well, I think that I agree with you that I mean, certainly this would be true. Let's take it a somewhat simpler case when we're talking about a definable and readily identifiable group. I mean, let's say a work group in an industrial organization. And let us say that you're doing a study in which you are comparing, you're giving each individual confidentiality, but you are comparing different groups, different units. And let's say you're saying that in Unit A, the morale is high, or in Unit A has such and such attitudes about management, and Unit B has others, and so on. Now, here's a situation in which it is conceivably possible that a given unit might be penalized for having the wrong opinions, or for revealing certain of their practices. And so even though you're protecting individual confidentiality, often the policy, and let's say in this case as expressed by management actions, deals with the work unit. And so therefore identifying the unit is really a matter of consequence. And so under these circumstances, I feel it would not be enough to single out each individual and get their consent, but in a sense you also have to somehow deal with their organizational representative. Now, you take that beyond that to a situation of where you're dealing with a whole segment of the population. Now there it becomes much more difficult. I mean, first of all, let me say I agree with the implication of your question, namely it is a problem, because it's a problem particularly for minority groups, let us say. Any group that is in a vulnerable position. So you take a segment of the society, the things that come out about them in a survey, or in a, let's say, I mean, the more obvious case would be, let's say, intelligence tests. I mean, we have historical experience about the possible effects that has. So the data that you provide about the group have an effect, or have a potential effect, on the reputation of that group in the larger society, and therefore on the policy on policies that might be directed at them and have an important impact on their fate. Now, the problem is that who makes a decision? You know, I mean, who decides what are risks that this large population group ought to be taking and what risks they ought not to be taking? You know, what is in the group's interests and what is not in the group's interests. The problem, of course, is that it's often a matter of debate. I mean, one can argue that, let us say, in the long run, blacks will benefit from certain kinds of research, whereas some elements of their leadership, of the group's leadership, might argue that they would suffer. So this becomes a matter of considerable controversy, and so I don't think that you can. I don't think that there are easy ways of handling the matter of informed consent in this kind of situation. But I would think that it would be very important, because of that, it would be very important to at least have a consultative process, to have a process in which representatives of that community or people who are sensitive to the needs of that community are brought into the, into the decision making about it. So I think it probably can't, this kind of decision probably cannot be handled in the, in the way in which we often handle individual informed consent, through the kinds of regulations that we now have for research with human beings, or through the institutional review procedures and so on. I think it has to be handled more at the policy level.
I wanted to ask you now, in the way you typically do field research, how have you approached this problem of informed consent? What's the order that you typically do things? I realize it differs from study to study, but generally, how do you go about setting up a field research study? What is the first contact you make? What is the first major decision you face in your mind?
Yeah. Well, the things that I have done that you might call field research vary so widely that I can't give you a kind of a general answer to that, but I mean, I can give you some examples.
Right. Or if you want to talk about participant observation now and move into specifically your area of interest now, that's fine. And then drawing that as an example of an ongoing...
Okay, well, let me tell you, so let me just put aside the question of informed consent and the ethical issues, and let's come back to those, because they are, I think they're very important.
Okay. Just understanding that as if you were addressing somebody who was completely not familiar with your work, so whatever background is needed.
You mean there are people who are not completely familiar with my work?
Maybe a few in the country, but I don't know around this area.
Well, all right, I will try to assume that there may be such people left. Well, what I've been doing for the last few years is what I would really describe as a type of action research, and I'll come back to that, because it has more in common with clinical research, I feel, than with the more traditional field research. Basically, I've been working on international conflict, especially on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I have an action research program in which I try to create opportunities for Arabs and Israelis, usually politically influential individuals. Typically the people I work with are people who are politically influential but not decision makers. And I try to create opportunities for these individuals to meet for direct discussions in which some of my colleagues and I act as a special kind of third party. So we play primarily a facilitative role. We create the context that allows these individuals to communicate with each other, and we create a special set of norms and ground rules for this communication, and then we intervene in the communication in a variety of ways to keep the process going, to introduce new ideas, to make observations, and so on and so forth. Basically, our purpose is to create a situation in which parties involved in an intense conflict can relate to each other in an analytic, relate to the conflict in an analytic problem-solving way. The kind of, we use the term problem-solving workshops for at least the ideal opportunity for this kind of communication, because we try to create an atmosphere and a set of norms and a set of procedures that will allow the participants to look at the conflict analytically and to come to view it as a joint problem that requires their joint effort at problem solving. And at the very least, it's our assumption is that this kind of situation can make it more likely that new ideas for conflict resolution will emerge. At the very least, we hope and have reason to believe that it's a situation in which the participants can learn something new. They can learn something about themselves, about their own side in the conflict, their own party. I'm not talking about themselves as individuals. We're not focusing on individuals here. We're focusing on the conflict between the communities. So they can learn something about their own side in the conflict. They can learn something about the other side in the conflict, and about the dynamics of the conflict, and about the possible ways in which conflict resolution may occur.
How do you get access to these people, and how do you choose a little more practical concerns, like where you hold the conference, who actually you do choose? I realize there.
Yeah. Well, this is a large part of the work. Identifying the people, getting access to them, and so on. And this is something that involves work over a long period of time, and one has to build credibility, one has to build contacts, and so on. And therefore, for the last 7 years, or 6 or 7 years, I have been traveling regularly to the Middle East, and I have been building contacts there. I see people there on a regular basis, and I meet new people. I also am associated here at Harvard with the Center for International Affairs, and I run the Middle East seminar at the Center for International Affairs, and as a result of my activities at the center, I have regular contacts with people from the Middle East in connection with my seminar, or people who come as short-term visitors or as long-term visitors, as fellows or as visiting scholars to the center or to other units of Harvard University, and so on. So I've gradually, over the years, I've become very much involved in all of the circles of people from the Middle East, at least who come to the United States, both officials and scholars, and so on. And, getting to know people, identifying people, being in a position where you can ask them to participate in your activities and so on. These are all things that require a long-term effort, that's built up over a number of years, in which people get to know you, and in which of course you have to start with a certain level of credibility, but your credibility is always on the line, essentially, and you always have to demonstrate it, and this is something that happens over a long period of time. Now, aside from the problems of access and credibility and so on, there are also problems of knowledge and information, and this is one of the important things that I have found in this work, that I need to know a great deal about the particular conflict that I'm working on. And now, at least this is my method. This is the way I go about it. I don't want to say that it's the only way to do it, and there are other ways of doing it. But in general, my position has become that, at least for myself, while my major asset, the major contribution that I feel I can make is the contribution of a generalist. Namely, I'm a social psychologist who has studied intergroup conflict and attitude change and group process and so on, and so that therefore I have professional knowledge about conflict in general, about conflict resolution, about ways of producing individual and social change, and so on. And these are my major contributions, really. And out of these, I have developed certain ideas about technique, about intervention technique. Out of these, as well as borrowing from various other forms of social and personal intervention. So my major contribution is that of a generalist. I'm not, I don't come to this as a Middle East specialist. On the other hand, I feel that in order to be credible, and in order to really know what is significant, who, just the kinds of questions you raised, who are the people that you select, how do you, in order to gain some insight into the dynamics of the conflict, into the barriers to conflict resolution, for all of these things, I feel I need to know a fair amount about the history and a great deal about current events, what is taking place, and something about the structure of each side, about the political structure and so on. And therefore I have to keep in touch constantly with what is going on. And this is, of course, another reason for my regular trips to the Middle East. Now, in my case, this has meant that it would be very difficult for me to work on several different conflicts at the same time, simply because it requires so much of my time and energy to stay in touch with what is happening in this particular conflict. I have, in fact, done some work on the Cyprus conflict, but that's one in which I've also had an interest over a number of years, actually off and on for maybe 15 years or more. So I'm not a total stranger to that, and I try to follow that too. But still, I see my relationship to that conflict as being quite different from my relationship to the Arab-Israeli conflict, because I really am not, I don't pretend to be as much in touch with what is going on there on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis as I do in the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Now, how do you measure your effectiveness? And realize there's no data points, but what's a measure of success, or a measure of improvement at least?
Yeah, well, I have to say at the outset that I don't have any formal measures of success, and I have not, in fact, engaged in any formal research procedures here, and maybe we can come to that in a minute, if you like, as to why I haven't engaged in formal research procedures. There are certain things, largely it is because it hasn't been possible for a variety of reasons. But on the other hand, there are also certain things that would have been possible that I haven't done simply because of time. So let me tell you what I see as, the way I can put it is why I feel that it's worth my while to continue the effort, although it may not be sufficient. It is not sufficient to demonstrate effectiveness of my approach in a formal kind of a way. Well, one is in the form of testimonials, which is always, for people who've worked on any kind of change procedures, that's always a risky business, because, testimonials are selective responses. You get testimonials from the people who feel that it has been positive. You may not hear anything from the people who feel that the experience has been negative. Also, these are qualitative, really self-reports. So testimonials are not evidence, but they are a kind of evidence. And I've had testimonials of two kinds. I've had testimonials from people who have participated in my, in workshops, and who have come and said that they have, and you have to remember, all the people that have participated in workshops with us are people who are quite sophisticated to begin with. These are not novices. These are people who have been centrally involved, but who nevertheless come afterwards and say that they have learned things that they had not ever learned before. They've had opportunities to interact with people on the other side that they have never had before. And so you have that kind of testimonial, but you also have testimonials. I've also had some testimonials from political figures who have told me that some of the activities that my colleagues and I have organized have made a direct contribution, for example, to the Egyptian-Israeli peace process. So you have testimonials of this kind. This is one. A second kind of evidence is observation of what the people who have participated in some of our activities, what they do. You know, most of these people are people who write and talk publicly about the conflict, and you can look at what they say or what they write. Now, this is one thing that I could have done more systematically. You know, I could have looked more systematically at some of these people's writings and pronouncements. I have not done that, but I do follow them, and there are a number of instances in which people, some of whom play important roles in the conflict, say some very different things and do different things after as compared to before. Now, I do not claim that as experimental evidence that they've changed as a result of participating in our workshops or whatever our other activities are, simply because these people, the people who participate in our workshops are already people who are predisposed to this kind of effort. Otherwise, they wouldn't come. And so in that sense, and I know there are people who do a variety of other things, so it would be very, very difficult. In fact, it would be impossible for me to say that they have changed specifically as a result of a particular workshop in which they participated. You know, in other words, to pinpoint what is this that produces the change is impossible. And I might add, for this reason also, the standard kind of evaluation method is not really appropriate to the situation. You know, the standard approach of evaluation where you say, okay, I'm introducing a particular program, a particular intervention, and I want to see what effect that intervention has. Now, I think that's impossible in our situation because we're dealing with a situation and with people who are involved in a whole variety of activities. And the main purpose of our workshops is not to produce a discriminable, identifiable piece of change, but to contribute to a larger process. In fact, I deliberately select people and time the workshops and set the agenda for these in such a way that they would contribute to a larger process. And so, given that situation, it's very difficult to then isolate that experience and say, it has produced a particular change. I think that's virtually impossible, and therefore I don't claim that, even though I can point to the changes in individuals, I don't claim that our experience, the experience that we provided, has uniquely produced these changes. All I can say is that I believe that we have contributed to a larger process in which these people and their communities are already involved. Now, another kind of evidence is the fact that, again, that's, you can raise the same kinds of questions about that evidence, but I will mention it, is that the people that have worked with us continue to be interested in working on direct communication and continue to be interested in working with us. In other words, in many cases, these are not just one-shot affairs, but I've established long-term relationships to some of these people, and they continue to be interested in that process. Now, again, I can't say that is strictly a result of their work with us, because they were obviously predisposed, and they're also participating in other kinds of activities. What I can say is that at least they have not been discouraged by their participation with us. Another kind of evidence of a different nature is that, and this is where, in a sense, the research part of this effort comes into the picture. For me, these workshops and other meetings and my travels and so on are an opportunity to learn something about the conflict, about the dynamics of the conflict, and about the possibilities for conflict resolution. In this way, this is what I mean by saying that it's a form of research, but it's a form of research that is directly tied to an action purpose. Now, I then try to distill what I've learned in papers I write and in lectures I give and so on, and I often, typically get the reactions of parties in the conflict to my own formulations. And insofar as they confirm, they validate what I'm, the conclusions that I've drawn from the meetings, that also represents a, some sign that at least I have learned something, what I have learned as a result of these, of my observation of these interactions seems to be to the point. And so that's another kind of, confirmation that something significant is going on. Well, these are some of the ways in which I conclude that there is a certain degree of effectiveness. Plus, of course, the process itself. Observing the process and what is happening, and one's impression that something is happening to the people. It's easier, I might add, to assess that part of it. To assess that the individuals who are participating are in fact learning something and are in fact changing their perceptions and their attitudes in some significant ways. That, I think, is easier to observe, to evaluate than the effect that this has on the larger policy process, for obvious reasons, because because we're only making a very small contribution to the larger. At best, I claim to be making only a very small contribution to the policy process, and to be certain that you have in fact made such a contribution that's the kind of evidence that's very hard to come by. Although this is why some of the testimonials coming from political decision makers are at least encouraging in that regard.
Now, you've described your role as a participant observer. With that role, obviously, comes the task of trying to remain objective and deciding when to intervene and how to intervene. If you could talk briefly what is meant by the term participant observation generally, and then how it's relevant to your role in this action research.
Well, of course, the role of participant observer is a very broad one. The more typical case of participant observation would be, let us say, someone who lives in a community, either because he or she is already a member of that community, or who joins that, comes to that community specifically in order to do research, and who just lives within that community and participates in the regular activities of that community. Or one can say the same thing about an organization, as a member of an organization or joins an organization. And in the process, while being a regular member of that community or that organization, the individual has opportunities to observe what is happening and to talk to people and so on. And essentially, it's immersing the investigator immerses himself or herself into the ongoing activities of the community or the organization. So that's your more typical type of participant observer. Now, I am a participant observer in this research more in the way in which, let us say, a psychotherapist would be a participant observer in a therapeutic relationship. This is, I said earlier that I see some, that my research in many ways is very much like clinical research, and this is what I want to elaborate on now. Although let me just say again that when I take this model, I do not want to imply that what I'm doing is psychotherapy. I'm not operating at the level of. It's very important for me to make that point, because as a psychologist working in international relations, I typically have the problem that people associate, their ideas about what a psychologist does, and people often assume that a psychologist working in international relations is interested in psychopathology, or is interested in the pathology of leaders, and is interested in trying to deal with this. And this is very, very far from my kind of operation. I'm interested in collective phenomena, and I'm interested in really in the psychological dimension of political processes, decision-making processes, and collective processes. So, I do not assume that one can just carry over individual psychology and certainly individual psychopathology to this level. So when I use the model of the psychotherapist, I'm only here talking about the nature of the research in a sense. The psychotherapist is a participant observer in a sense in an ongoing process in which the psychotherapist, however, has a particular role. Now, in the same way, I am in my role as a third party, as a sort of mediator, or I prefer to say facilitator, of interaction between the conflicting parties, I have an opportunity to observe that interaction. And this is a very unique opportunity, an opportunity to see parties in conflict interact with each other in an intense, analytic way. And I have, in a sense, a first row seat at this kind of interaction. And of course, I'm there not just as an observer. I am there as a significant participant, because I provide the context for it, and I, as you said, I intervene. I provide the context. I define the norms and the ground rules. I play a role in enforcing those rules, and I intervene in a variety of different ways. Now, how you intervene, this of course varies with the occasion. It varies with the style, and so on. In my own case, my interventions, I tend to be fairly non-directive in my general approach. My major interventions really are in setting the stage and defining the rules and laying out a certain kind of agenda. And I would say perhaps the most important things that I do happen before the workshop actually convenes. It is because I talk individually to each of the people who are going to be involved. I tell them what will be involved. I tell them about the ground rules and so on and so forth. Answer their questions, discuss the agenda with them, and all of that. And I play an important role, in a sense, there as a repository of trust for the different sides. I do not assume that you can create in this kind of workshop a situation in which parties who are involved in a very, very intense, long-term conflict can begin to trust each other. But what I think can be done is that they can come to trust the situation, so that they can come to feel that in this situation they can be free to interact with each other and to entertain new ideas and all of that. And a lot of that is by virtue of the third party. In a sense, by virtue of each of the other of the first, by the first and second parties' trust in us, they are able to have enough trust in the situation so that they can interact with the other. So they can really establish a working trust with the adversary. Now, in the sessions themselves, a lot of what I do is summarizing, and occasionally we will intervene, and we use three kinds of interventions. The most interesting kind of intervention would be a process intervention, where we might look at something that is happening here and now in the interaction between the participants that seems to be odd, or that they don't seem to understand. And we can then come in and say, well, perhaps we can understand this in terms of some element of the dynamics of the conflict. So we use the ongoing process. The way in which a therapist or an encounter group leader, a T group leader, analytic group leader, might use the ongoing process in the situation here to learn something about the dynamics of the conflict. The difference, of course, is that we're not focusing on what this tells us about the individuals involved, or indeed about their interpersonal relations. We're only focusing on what this may tell us about the relationships between their communities, about the intergroup. We're working only at the intergroup level. But what is happening in the interaction between these individuals here and now very often reflects some of the dynamics of the intergroup conflict. So on occasion, we will come in and point that out and essentially raise that as a question. do you think this is what might be going on, in the hope that we are touching on something significant which will then lead to further insight. Another kind of intervention would be a content observation, in which we will pick up some things that are being said, essentially, as a basis for making a generalization. You know, let's say, pointing out some of the convergences or divergences in the views of the two sides, or something about the kinds of concerns that seem to be cropping up regularly. And I'm particularly interested, as part of my process, I'm particularly interested in parallelisms. Something that parties usually resist because when you're involved in a conflict, you generally assume that the biggest difference is between our goodness and their badness, and now, of course, when I point to parallelisms, they are not meant as moral parallelisms. I'm not talking about moral symmetry or even complete empirical symmetry, but I'm usually picking up what I see as functional equivalences in the sides of in both sides, which I think are part of the part of what is involved in conflict. It's why conflict escalates and perpetuates itself has to do with the fact that the sides are in fact feeding each other, that there are these reciprocal processes going on.
What about misinterpretations, even as simple as language barriers? How do you, there are obvious cultural differences. Do you direct and try to help each side understand the different cultural perspectives?
We will on occasion do that, although on occasion we will do that. Usually we're dealing with people who are quite sophisticated, and the language, I might say, is in all of the things that I've done has been English. So both parties are at something of a disadvantage, although we've generally dealt with, most of the people we've dealt with are people who are very, very fluent in English, and so we're very fortunate in that respect. You know, a third party whose own language is English, I think, has great advantages over a third party whose language is something else. But we will occasionally do that. But I must say it has not happened. It has not happened very often. It may be partly because we're dealing with sophisticated people. It may be partly because of my own bias. My own bias is that although I definitely agree that there are cultural differences and that these cultural differences sometimes create barriers to communication, but my feeling is that these are sometimes overdone. You know, overemphasized, that sometimes the barriers are more situational, they arise more out of the dynamics of the conflict rather than out of the particular cultural dispositions of the parties. And so I may be somewhat less inclined to do that, but in principle I agree that this may be true, and certainly one of the things that in principle I would do would be to, let us say, point to let's say, some of the concerns that are rooted in the particular historical experience of one of the sides. Now, broadly speaking, those are cultural differences. Now, that's the kind of thing, you know, in other words, trying to point out that what the other is saying or doing can be understood. It's not necessarily bad faith or totally bad faith, as you think, but it can be understood as coming out of certain historical traumas, let us say, and certain historical experiences that this party is working through. I mean, this would be one kind of thing one kind of intervention that I think would be highly relevant. Another thing would, might be sometimes you might want to point out that, well, let's say in the whole process of reconciliation, that there are certain steps have certain meanings within certain cultures, and these may sometimes not be understood by the other party. So there's definitely a place for this kind of intervention. with regard to taping, this is something that I've discussed and discussed with my colleagues back and forth, and we have established a policy so far on our workshops that we do not tape anything, and it's very, very tempting, and just recently I was exploring the possibility with respect to one workshop. I started to kind of try to open this up and even talk about videotaping, and the reaction that I got to that led me to back off again. Basically, the reason we don't tape is because we don't want to interfere with the process. You know, we feel that anything that, and I have confirmed that, you know, that even if people were to say, well, go ahead, you know, I always say what I want to say anyway, but that the fact that what they're saying is going to become part of a permanent record is an inhibiting element. And in my kind of situation, now you know, sometimes that's, I mean, in many situations, I would say, okay, it's a price worth paying. You know, I mean, you collect important kinds of data, and if it inhibits a little bit, well, okay, and usually people forget, after they get into the process, they forget about the fact that they're being taped and all of that. But in this situation, it is so critical. You see, a critical element of the whole procedure is to allow people to interact in a private situation in which they can forget, for the moment at least, about their constituencies. You know, we don't want them to forget completely about the constituencies, but we don't want them to talk only to their constituencies. We want them to talk to each other. And that's the problem in a conflict situation, that generally the parties don't talk to each other. They don't talk to each other in a way that involves listening and understanding. They only talk to each other, they listen only in a completely tactical way. And they're mainly concerned with, when they say something, they're not concerned with how this will sound to the adversary, but how it will sound to their own constituencies, or sometimes to a third party. Now, it's precisely that we're trying to get away from. We're trying to create a situation in which communication can actually become a way in which people can learn something from each other, in which interaction, you know, direct interaction can actually produce its potential of an emerging new product. Now, since that's the essence of what we're doing, I believe in doing everything possible to protect that, and therefore taping, even if it wouldn't totally destroy it, even if it makes something of a difference, I've decided not to use it so far. We do, however, take careful notes. Somehow, and people know that, of course, but somehow that is not, you know, notes are different, because that becomes your interpretation of what they're saying, but to put themselves on a tape is a different situation. So we take almost verbatim notes, I mean, not verbatim, but almost verbatim notes. And that, incidentally, is something, again, to come back to the question of research, of evaluation that you asked before, that's there. We could analyze that. I haven't done it systematically, again, because of time, mostly. But that's there, and we can certainly use it. Now, at the end of each day, or in fact, usually, you know, at the end of, let's say, at lunchtime, and then in the evening, generally the third-party team, will get together and kind of review where we've gone and where we're going. And my typical procedure has been to start each session with an interpretive summary of what happened before. And that is really, those are my major interventions, actually, at the beginning of the sessions. That's not necessarily the best way to do it, and the only way to do it, and I do, you know, intervene at other points too, but those have been, in fact, those have been my major interventions. And of course, people don't usually accept completely my interpretation of what happened, and so that then becomes, there is a discussion about what actually happened, you know, with some differences, and that helps to clarify certain things and then move us on. So these interpretive summaries I think have been very useful.
And now what about what you hope to do next, and how you can, I guess part of your goal must be to help people to learn some of the skills that you're learning, if more of this is to go on, this type of action, conflict resolution research. What are the opportunities available? Is it available in doctoral training? Is it available in governmental service? And where do you hope to see the future of your own research go?
Okay, well, so let me start with what I hope to do next. I mean, what I hope to do next is really, in a sense, more of the same. But I feel that there is an opportunity which I think stems partly from political developments and partly from the development of my own work. I feel that there is an opportunity for the kind of approach that I'm using to become more directly plugged into the policy process. And what I'm really concentrating on right now is the pre-negotiation process. Substantively, I'm focusing on the Palestinian issue, and starting with the proposition that it is the core issue that must be resolved if there is to be genuine peace, and if, for example, the Egyptian-Israeli peace process, which I think is very significant, but if it is to maintain and fulfill itself, it must be widened. It must lead to a comprehensive peace, for which the solution to the Palestinian problem is central. Now, and my argument is consistent with my whole approach that part of that process involves direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. I'm not saying that that is all that's involved, because we are dealing with a multilateral process in which other parties, other Arab powers and the superpowers and maybe some Europeans and so on all play a role. There's no question about that. But part of the process must be direct negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians, and there are tremendous barriers to that, which I can't go into right now. But what I am essentially doing, feel that I can do, is to contribute significantly to the pre-negotiation process, to helping to create the conditions that would make negotiations possible. And this involves working more directly with decision makers. Now, this is not something that I can do in a day. I mean, it is a process that I have been working on for some time and will probably be continuing to work on for some time more to come. But that's really what I'm concentrating on. Now, to come to the question of training, this has been a great frustration for me, because the opportunity for training students and others in this are rather limited. For one thing, because these workshops occur very, very infrequently. Like what I'm doing now, I've already been working on it for a year, and I may work on it for another year before I will ever get the parties together. And even when I do get them together, the situation is so confidential because of what I've already described, that I can't bring observers into it. I may be able to bring one student in to take notes, but I can't bring large numbers. Now, what I have partly what I've done to correct for that is to do workshops which I'm doing one this coming spring, and I've done some before, in conjunction with my seminar on social psychological approaches to international relations. I run a workshop. Now, the one that we're doing planning to do this spring is an Israeli-Palestinian workshop, in fact. A couple of years ago, I did one on the Cyprus conflict. Now, these are, they're training workshops in the sense that I do not, I'm not able to offer the same degree of confidentiality that I would for the other experiences, because part of the purpose is to allow students to participate and to observe. And so we're bringing in a larger group of observers. Now, while the students are informed about the requirements of confidentiality and all of that, nevertheless, when you have 20 people who are involved one way or another, and some of whom are not really professionals, the chances of leakage and all of that are much greater. And I have to be completely honest to the participants in telling them that. This is part of the informed consent process. And so I therefore don't work with people who are at the same level. Although the people that are involved are people who are significant. They are senior graduate students or young professionals, and they are people who are members of the elites in their own societies, and so they're definitely significant people, but they're not as close to the decision-making process as the people that I work with in the more in the regular workshops. And these are, full-scale workshops, which I think do provide an opportunity for students to get some practice, in fact, as being members of the third-party team. See, the students alternate in sitting around the table as part of the third-party team, and the rest of the time they sit behind the one-way mirror and observe, and of course they participate in all the other activities, pre-workshop sessions, the meals, social events that go with the workshop, and so on. So these have been I think, provided some opportunities for direct participation. Now, on a larger scale, I'm hoping that the proposal that is now before the Congress for a National Peace Academy will go through, and that represents an effort to provide on a larger scale training in the whole array of conflict resolution third-party techniques. Mine is not the only approach. And I agree with, I think there was an implication in your question that the way I'm going about things presents a bit of a problem for training, because it requires so much specific involvement in the particular conflict, and that of course would be very difficult for, you can't train people. Not many people have the kind of opportunity that I have to concentrate on one conflict. I mean, I have that opportunity because I'm working out of an academic base, and I'm pretty much running this as my research program, and I can direct it in any way I want. But if people were to do this on a professional basis, they would have to obviously be prepared to diversify much more. But I think that this is possible. I think that in part, I'm engaged really in a process of developing something new, and I think that as it becomes more fully formulated and systematized and so on, I think it should be possible for us to train people so that they can work on more than one conflict at a time.
That's good. I want to, we don't have too much, we're doing Dave McClellan after this, so I wondered if you could talk more to ethical issues and then finish with anything that you feel you'd like to emphasize or that's important to you.
Well, let me just say very, very briefly that there are some very serious ethical issues involved, and in fact, one of the things that I hope to do, as you know, I've done a lot of writing on ethical issues in research. I have not done any writing yet on the ethical issues in my particular intervention model per se, not because I haven't thought about it, but because, I just, it's a model that's still very much in the process of development. But the big protection here is that as far as not doing anything that might endanger people's interests. Maybe I should step back for a moment and say that in some respects we're dealing with with ultimate kinds of ethical problems. For some of the people, participation in the kinds of workshops that I organize represents a real physical danger. In other words, they may be putting their lives at risk because they are involved, because participating in such an effort is a political act. And it's a controversial political act. So it may be in extreme cases they may be risking their lives. At the very least, they're risking their political fortunes, or their credibility within their own communities, their ability to have influence, and so on. So there are serious risks involved for the individuals. There also are risks involved for the communities, for societies, because while what I'm trying to do is to separate communication as a learning process from communication as a political act. But in the outside world, you can't do that, and this is one of the reasons it's very hard for me to get people to participate, because because communication is seen as a political act, with the most obvious thing being an implication that you're recognizing the other. So for Israelis, for example, to meet with certain Palestinians may imply that they're recognizing the PLO. For Palestinians to meet with certain Israelis may imply that they're recognizing Israel's legitimacy and so on. And so these are the barriers. And the engaging in communication, and which are of course geared to the whole, while there's no, I do not take a political position per se, and the participants don't take a political position by participating in communication. The very communication itself is a political position, namely it implies that there is some value in direct communication between these two parties. So this may have implications for their political stance. So there are these kinds of risks, personal risks, political risks, and risks from the point of view of their interests with respect to the conflict. Now, the protection here is that I'm dealing with people who are very aware of these risks. They are politically involved people, and they will not participate. And I have no hold over them. The only possible hold that I have over people is that insofar as I'm dealing with fellow academics or intellectuals, they want to appear as people who are reasonable. They want to appear to me as people who are reasonable and who are willing to talk and so on. So that's some degree, that is a degree of power that I have. But I can assure you that that is not going to be. They're not going to decide to participate just in order to please me or just in order to appear to me as people who are reasonable. They will decide to participate if they feel that the potential benefits of this are greater than the risks. And so because I don't have any real important power, and that I can only get people to participate if they decide that it is in their interest to do so, and that the risks, which are very real, are worth the potential benefits. So the kind of risk-benefit analysis that one has to do is what I can expect these people to be doing because of the whole situation that they're in. Now, my part, of course, is to be completely honest with them, and to be honest in terms of what I will do and what I will not do, and how much I can protect confidentiality, be honest about the level of commitment by the other side, and so on and so forth. I mean, this, in other words, I give them all the relevant information about the procedure and about the possible consequences. I'm very, very meticulous about confidentiality. I'm very meticulous. On the other hand, I never promise anyone 100% confidentiality because I know that I can't control the situation 100%. And when I'm doing the one with students, I'm very clear about saying that my usual degree promises of confidentiality must be reduced by a certain amount because I have less control in this situation. I have a very good record in terms of maintaining confidentiality, but I don't promise. I try not to promise something that I can't deliver.
One final question now. What do you find? We end the interviews typically with what do you find most personally satisfying about what you're doing, and personally satisfying about the implications that it may have? Obviously, you've expressed a lot of that already, but in a summary statement.
Well, I guess the most personally satisfying is the fact that I feel that in this work I am using virtually everything that I know, that I have learned, that I have been. Virtually all elements of my identity, of my experience, of my training, of my skills, and of my theoretical knowledge and so on. Virtually all of it is really being utilized in this work. I'm just looking in terms of the most obvious part, my theoretical, my substantive knowledge. I have worked in the areas of attitude change and communication and social influence. I have worked in the areas of international relations and international conflict, and I've done some work in psychotherapy and in group process and so on. Now, all of these are coming together in this work, but in addition to that, my long-term interest in the Middle East and in Arab-Israeli conflict, which goes back to my own Jewish identity and my own background, my own Jewish training in Jewish studies and all of that, my long-term interest in and involvement in the peace movement and in the development of nonviolent approaches to conflict resolution and so on. All of these are really coming together, and I think this is, for me personally, it's the most exciting thing. I mean, it really gives me a sense of continuity in terms of my life. Now, in terms of its impact, if I can feel that I'm making even a small contribution to peace in the Middle East, and therefore I think to peace more generally, I feel that that's all I can really ask for.